Sterling Knox had pulled 17 souls from burning buildings in his lifetime, but only one had ever asked him why he let the others die. The autumn of 1863 painted the Montana Territory in shades of amber and ash, where the wind carried both the promise of winter and the lingering smoke of war. Sterling Knox stood on his porch, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold, watching his 8-year-old son Everett chase chickens through the yard with the reckless joy of a boy who'd never known his mother's touch. You can almost smell the dust settling on this remote ranch, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, where the silence stretched so wide it seemed to swallow sound itself. Sterling had chosen this isolation deliberately, a man's sanctuary from the memories that stalked him through sleepless nights. The flames had started as a distant orange glow on the horizon, no bigger than a sunset. But sunsets don't grow. Papa, look! Everett's voice cut through the evening stillness, his small finger pointing toward the southern ridge. The sky's on fire. Sterling's cup shattered against the porch boards. He knew that glow, had seen it consume too many homes, too many dreams. The Hartwell place lay 3 miles south, where young widow Myrtle Delphine had been trying to work her late husband's claim with nothing but stubbornness and prayer. Everett, harness bell now. Sterling's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers through hell itself. His son scrambled toward the barn without question, sensing the gravity that had suddenly wrapped around his father like a funeral shroud. That Sterling's hands moved with practiced efficiency, loading his wagon with buckets, rope, and the heavy woolen blankets that might mean the difference between life and death. His mind raced through calculations, wind direction, the density of the pine forest, how long it would take flames to reach the main house. The ride to the Hartwell place felt both endless and too short. Each bounce of the wagon wheels marked another second lost, another foot of ground the fire would claim. Sterling had learned to read flames the way other men read books. Their hunger, their speed, their merciless logic. But when they crested the final hill, his heart lurched against his ribs. The main house blazed like a torch against the darkening sky, its windows glowing orange as demon eyes. The barn had already collapsed into itself, sending sparks dancing toward the stars like twisted prayers. And there, silhouetted against the inferno, stood a figure too small to be fighting such a battle alone. Myrtle Delphine held a bucket that seemed to mock the enormity of the flames consuming her world. Her dark hair had escaped its pins, framing a face streaked with soot and tears. She moved with the desperate rhythm of someone who refuses to accept defeat, even when defeat towers 50 feet above her head. Myrtle! Sterling's voice boomed across the clearing as he leaped from the wagon. Where are the children? Her eyes found his through the smoke, and something in them made his blood freeze. Inside, she whispered, then louder, they're inside. Sterling had stormed Confederate entrenchments with less fear than he felt in that moment. The house groaned like a dying animal, its support beams singing their swan song in the language of splintering wood and collapsing dreams. How many? He was already moving toward the house, his body remembering the weight of responsibility he'd carried through 2 years of war. 3. Myrtle's voice broke. Little Sarah's only 4, and the twins. Sterling didn't wait for her to finish. He plunged into the smoke-choked doorway, his shirt pulled up over his nose and mouth. The heat hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and the moisture from his eyes. The children huddled in the root cellar, their faces pale as winter moonlight in the hellish glow. Sarah clutched her rag doll with the fierce grip of childhood terror, while the 6-year-old twins, James and Joseph, pressed against each other like 2 halves of the same frightened heart. Easy now. Sterling's voice remained steady despite the chaos around them. We're going home. He gathered Sarah in his arms first, her small body trembling against his chest as he carried her through the gauntlet of flame and falling timber. The house screamed its protest, but Sterling had learned to move through screaming. 1 trip, 2 trips, 3 trips. But as he set young Joseph down beside his siblings in the safety of the yard, a sound split the night that would haunt Sterling Knox for the rest of his days. The groan of the main support beam giving way, followed by the thunderous collapse of the second floor, where the staircase had been. Now only flames danced. Myrtle's scream cut through the roar of the fire like a blade through silk. The twins' parents. They were upstairs. They were. Sterling's world tilted. In the chaos and smoke, he'd focused only on the children's voices, only on the small hands reaching toward salvation. He'd never heard the voices from above, never seen the adult figures who must have been trapped in the upper rooms. I tried to tell you, Myrtle gasped, her words tumbling over each other like stones down a hillside. I tried to say, but you were already moving, and the children were crying. And I thought there was time. The weight of understanding settled on Sterling's shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd saved the children, yes. But somewhere in the mathematics of rescue, in the split-second decisions that separate the living from the dead, he'd left two souls to burn. The twins, James and Joseph, stood with their small hands clasped together, their eyes wide with a terrible understanding that no 6-year-old should possess. They'd lost more than a house tonight. They'd lost everything. Sterling Knox had pulled 17 souls from burning buildings in his lifetime. Tonight, he'd saved 3 and lost 2 and in the years that would follow, as he raised those orphaned twins alongside his own son, one question would echo through the Montana silence like a ghost that refused to rest. Why didn't you save them? First, 3 months had passed since the fire, and the Montana winter had settled over Sterling's ranch like a heavy quilt, beautiful, suffocating, and impossible to escape. The 4 children moved through the house like ghosts learning to be human again, their laughter tentative and rare as first snow. Sterling had built an addition to accommodate his unexpected family, hammering each nail with the methodical precision of a man trying to build something solid from the wreckage of good intentions. But every board he laid seemed to echo with the same haunting refrain. Why didn't you save them first? Myrtle Delphine had taken residence in the small cabin that served as the ranch's guest quarters, officially hired as governess and housekeeper. Unofficially, she'd become the gravitational center around which their fractured household orbited. Her presence filled the spaces where silence had once reigned, singing lullabies to chase away nightmares, reading stories by lamplight, braiding little Sarah's hair with the gentle patience of someone who understood that healing moved at its own stubborn pace. You can almost feel the tension that thrummed between Sterling and Myrtle like a wire stretched too tight. Part attraction, part guilt, part something neither dared name. The twins asked about their parents again last night. Myrtle said one morning, her hands busy with breakfast preparations, but her eyes watching Sterling's face for some sign of the storm she knew brewed beneath his calm exterior. Sterling's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. What did you tell them? The truth. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned that lies, however kindly meant, eventually burned hotter than any fire. That their mama and papa love them. That sometimes good people are taken too soon. That it's not their fault. But it might be mine. The words hung unspoken in the kitchen air, thick as smoke. James and Joseph had taken to following Sterling around the ranch like twin shadows, their small hands eager to help with chores that seemed enormous in their grip. They split wood with hatchets too heavy for their arms, fed chickens with the serious concentration of generals planning battles, and watched Sterling with eyes that held too much understanding for their tender years. Uncle Sterling, Joseph, said one afternoon as they mended fence posts, using the title that had evolved naturally from the awkwardness of their situation. Mama Myrtle says you saved us from the fire. Sterling's hands stilled on the wire he was stretching. She did she? But James had a dream last night. He saw Mama and Papa calling for help, and you walked past their room. Joseph's voice held no accusation, only the terrible honesty of childhood. Why didn't you hear them? The question hit Sterling like a physical blow. He'd been preparing for this conversation for months, rehearsing answers that might make sense to a 6-year-old mind. But faced with those trusting eyes, all his carefully constructed explanations crumbled to ash. Sometimes, Sterling said finally, choosing each word like a man walking through a minefield. When everything's happening at once, and the smoke is thick, and people are scared, sometimes we can only hear the voices that cry out the loudest. Joseph considered this with the gravity of a small philosopher. Were we crying louder than Mama and Papa? Children's voices carry differently, Sterling replied, and it was both true and the most inadequate truth he'd ever spoken. They cut through danger in ways that adult voices sometimes don't. That evening, As Sterling sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire, Myrtle emerged from the cabin wrapped in a shawl that had belonged to her late husband. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to walk softly through a world that had already taken too much. "You can't carry this forever," she said, settling into the chair beside him without invitation. "The guilt will eat you alive from the inside out." Sterling's laugh held no humor. "You think I should just forget? Move on like it never happened? I think you should remember that you saved 3 children that night." Her voice carried the steel that had helped her survive widowhood and tragedy. "I think you should remember that in the space of minutes, with a house collapsing around you, you made choices that kept 3 babies breathing and let 2 adults die and couldn't save 2 adults." The distinction in her words was subtle, but significant. There's a difference between letting someone die and being unable to save them. Sterling turned to study her profile in the dying light. "You were there. You saw what happened. How can you sit here and comfort the man who ran into a burning building 3 times to save my sister's children?" Myrtle's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed exterior. "Who risked his own life while I stood frozen in the yard? Who's given those children a home and a future when they had nothing left but ashes?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they were trying to build from the ruins. "I hear them sometimes," Sterling admitted quietly. "In the wind, in the creak of the house at night. Voices calling for help that I never heard in time." Myrtle reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, real, anchoring him to the present moment. "Then maybe it's time you started listening to the voices that are still here." As if summoned by her words, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the house. Everett and Sarah playing some game that involved much giggling and theatrical gasping. The twins' voices joined in, tentative at first, then growing stronger, more certain. "They're healing," Myrtle observed. "Are they?" Sterling's eyes remained fixed on the mountains. "Or are they just learning to live with the wounds? Maybe there's no difference." She stood, her shawl catching the last light like wings. "Maybe healing isn't about forgetting what we've lost. Maybe it's about learning to carry the weight without letting it crush us." She paused at the porch steps, her hand resting on the railing. "The children aren't the only ones who need to learn that lesson," Sterling Knox. As she walked back toward her cabin, Sterling remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds that had become the soundtrack to his fractured peace. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound both mournful and wild, carrying across the valley like a question waiting for an answer. But in the house behind him, the children were settling into sleep, their breathing steady and trusting. And for the first time in months, Sterling began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the voices he'd been hearing weren't accusations at all. Maybe they were permissions to forgive himself. Spring arrived early that year, as if the Montana Territory had grown tired of winter's grip and decided to shrug it off like an old coat. The children had begun to bloom alongside the wildflowers. Sarah's laughter came easier now, and the twins had started finishing each other's sentences again, the way they had before the fire stole their voices. Sterling found himself watching Myrtle more often than was proper, noting how she moved through his house with increasing confidence, how she hummed while she worked, how her eyes had begun to hold light again instead of just reflecting it. The space between them had grown smaller with each passing day, measured in shared glances over the children's heads and the comfortable silence of 2 people learning to trust again. But it was Everett who brought the letter, thundering into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the excitement of a boy who'd been entrusted with something important. "Papa." The mail rider left this for Miss Myrtle. He thrust the cream-colored envelope forward like a prize, his face flushed with the importance of his mission. Myrtle accepted the letter with trembling fingers, her face going pale as winter snow when she recognized the elegant script. Sterling watched her carefully, noting the way her breath caught, the way she pressed the envelope against her chest as if it might escape. "If you'll excuse me," she whispered, and fled to her cabin without another word. You can almost feel the shift in the air, the way happiness can turn to dread in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sterling tried to focus on the day's work, but his attention kept drifting toward the cabin where Myrtle had disappeared. The children sensed the change too. They moved through their lessons with unusual quiet, their eyes darting toward the windows as if waiting for something to break. When Myrtle finally emerged, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of farewell. She walked toward the main house with the deliberate steps of someone who'd made a terrible decision and was determined to see it through. "Sterling, might I speak with you?" Her voice carried a formality that hadn't been there since the early days after the fire. They sat on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations, but tonight the silence felt different, charged with electricity, like the air before a storm. Myrtle held the letter in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges as if memorizing their shape. "I have family back east," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My aunt in Philadelphia. She's offered me a position. A good position with her husband's importing business. A chance to start fresh, away from." She gestured vaguely toward the horizon, encompassing everything. The ranch, the memories, the life they'd been building from ashes. Sterling felt something cold settle in his chest. "Away from what, Myrtle?" She finally looked at him, and he saw tears tracking silver paths down her cheeks. "Away from the constant reminder of what I lost. Away from the guilt that eats at me every time I look at those children. Away from the way I've been trying to replace their mother when I have no right to that role." "The children love you," Sterling said quietly. "They need you. The children need stability. They need parents who can give them a future without shadows." She stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing. "They need more than a woman who freezes when buildings burn and a man who what?" Sterling's voice carried a sharp edge. "A man who saved their lives?" Myrtle whirled to face him, her composure finally cracking. "A man who saved them while their parents burned alive upstairs. A man who has to live with that choice every single day, and who's trying to build a life on top of that foundation." The words hung between them like a physical presence, raw and undeniable. Sterling stood slowly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Is that what you think of me?" His voice was dangerous quiet. "That I'm some kind of monster who chose which lives to save?" "No." The word burst from her like a sob. "That's just it. I don't think you're a monster. I think you're a hero who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. And I think every day you wake up and carry that weight, and I think watching you carry it is slowly killing me." Sterling stared at her, stunned by the raw honesty in her voice. "Myrtle, I'm falling in love with you," she continued, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "I'm falling in love with your kindness, your strength, the way you've opened your heart to those children despite your own pain. And I hate myself for it because loving you feels like betraying my sister's memory, like dancing on the graves of the people who died that night." The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet, rearranging the landscape of everything he thought he understood. "Your sister," he managed. Myrtle's face crumpled. Mary Hartwell. She was my younger sister, Sterling. Those weren't just some widow's children you saved that night. Those were my nephews, my niece, and the parents who died upstairs." Her voice broke entirely. "That was Mary and her husband Thomas. My sister and her husband burned to death while you saved their children." The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. All these months, he'd been carrying the weight of saving strangers' children while strangers died. But they weren't strangers to Myrtle. They were family, and she'd been living in his house, caring for his son, falling in love with the man who'd made the split-second decision that left her sister dead. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out as a whisper. "Because I needed to understand why," Myrtle said, her voice steadier now that the truth was finally between them. "I needed to understand how a man makes that choice. I needed to see if you were the kind of person who could live with it, or if you were the kind who would be destroyed by it." Sterling felt everything shifting, recontextualizing. Every kindness she'd shown him, every moment of tenderness, every time she'd comforted him through his guilt, it all took on new meaning now. "And what did you decide?" he asked. Myrtle met his eyes, and in them he saw pain and love and a terrible, beautiful honesty. "I decided that you're the kind of man who runs into burning buildings to save children. I decided that you're the kind of man who takes in orphans and gives them a home. I decided that you're the kind of man worth loving, even when loving you breaks my heart." She picked up the letter from where it had fallen. "But I also decided that some loves are too heavy to carry. Some foundations are too shaky to build on. And some truths are too big to live with." Sterling watched her walk back toward her cabin, his mind reeling from the weight of revelation. She'd known. All along, she'd known exactly what he'd done, exactly what it had cost, exactly who had paid the price. And tomorrow, she would leave to start a new life, taking with her the only peace he'd found since the night everything burned. But first, he needed to understand why she'd really stayed so long. The morning Myrtle was supposed to leave, Sterling woke to the sound of horses approaching fast, too fast for friendly visitors. He rolled from his bed and reached for the rifle that had never left his side since the war, his body moving with the instinctive precision of a man who'd learned to read danger in the rhythm of hoofbeats. Through the window, he counted 6 riders cresting the hill, their faces hard as winter stone. At their head rode a man Sterling recognized from wanted posters, Jake Murdoch, a Confederate deserter who'd turned his wartime skills toward less honorable pursuits. The kind of man who'd heard about a prosperous ranch with a single defender and decided it looked like easy pickings. You can almost smell the danger riding in with the morning mist, sharp and metallic like the taste of blood. Sterling's mind raced through possibilities. Everett was still asleep in the loft. The twins and Sarah were in the addition. Myrtle would be packing her belongings in the cabin, unaware that her departure might be delayed by circumstances far more final than missed stagecoaches. That he moved through the house like a ghost, checking ammunition, positioning himself where he could see both the front approach and the cabin where Myrtle was preparing to leave his life forever. The irony wasn't lost on him. After months of trying to save everyone, he might lose them, all in a single morning. Sterling knocks. Murdoch's voice carried across the yard like a challenge. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and maybe we'll let the woman and children live." Sterling's blood turned to ice. They'd been watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. And they'd chosen the morning when his world was already falling apart. "What do you want?" Sterling called back, his voice steady despite the storm, raging in his chest. "What every man wants," Murdoch replied with a laugh that held no warmth. "What's yours?" "The cattle, the horses, whatever coin you've got stashed away. And maybe some time with that pretty governess before we ride on." Through the window, Sterling saw Myrtle step onto her cabin porch, a carpetbag in her hand and confusion written across her face. She looked toward the main house, then toward the riders, and understanding dawned in her eyes like a terrible sunrise. "Papa." Everett's voice came from the loft, small and frightened. "What's happening?" "Stay low, son," Sterling murmured. "Keep the other children quiet and away from the windows." He watched Myrtle set down her bag and move toward the main house, her face set with the determination of someone who'd already lost. Too much to fear losing more. But Murdoch's men had spread out, cutting off her path. "Well now," one of them called out, his voice thick with implications that made Sterling's trigger finger itch. "Looks like the lady was planning to leave. Can't have that." Sterling felt the familiar cold settle over him, the same ice that had carried him through Shiloh and Antietam, through moments when the difference between life and death was measured in heartbeats and the willingness to pull a trigger. He'd hoped never to feel that cold again, but some skills, once learned, never truly leave. "Let her go," Sterling called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers through hell. "This is between you and me." "No, Knox," Murdoch replied, dismounting with the casual confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "This is between us and everyone you care about. That's what makes it interesting." Sterling saw Myrtle's hands clench into fists at her sides. Even from a distance, he could read the fury in her posture, the rage of a woman who'd watched her world burn once and wouldn't stand idle while it happened again. "You boys picked the wrong ranch," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And you picked the wrong man to threaten." Murdoch laughed. "Did we now? And what's a schoolmarm gonna do about it?" What happened next would replay in Sterling's memory for the rest of his life. Myrtle reached into her carpetbag and withdrew something that glinted in the morning sun, a small derringer, the kind a woman might carry for protection on long journeys. Her movements were smooth, practiced, deadly. "I'm not a schoolmarm," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. "I'm a woman who's already lost everything once. I won't lose it again." The first shot took Murdoch in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second sent his men scrambling for cover behind their horses. And in that moment of chaos, Sterling moved and he burst through the front door like an avenging angel, his rifle speaking in the ancient language of survival. The war had taught him to think in terms of geometry, angles of fire, cover, and concealment, the mathematics of violence. But this wasn't war. This was protection, pure and simple. The battle was brief but brutal. Sterling's marksmanship, honed by years of conflict, found its targets with mechanical precision. Myrtle's unexpected competence with her small weapon created chaos in the raiders' ranks, disrupting their coordinated assault. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay still in the yard. 2 more were wounded but alive, their hands raised in surrender. Murdoch himself sat slumped against his horse, clutching his shoulder and staring at Myrtle with newfound respect. "Who are you?" he gasped. Myrtle stood in the middle of the yard, her dress torn and her hair wild, looking like some vengeful spirit of the frontier. "I'm Mary Hartwell's sister," she said simply, "and I'm done running from fires." Sterling approached her slowly, his rifle still ready but his eyes focused on her face. "Myrtle." She met his gaze, and he saw something there he'd never seen before. Not the gentle governess, not the grieving sister, but a woman who'd been tested by flame and emerged as something harder, more dangerous, more real. "I lied to you," she said quietly. "About why I stayed. About what I was looking for." "What do you mean?" "I didn't come here to understand your choice, Sterling. I came to judge it. I came to decide whether you were a hero or a coward, whether you deserve to live with what you'd done or whether you deserve to burn for it." Sterling felt the ground shift beneath his feet again. "And what did you decide?" Myrtle looked at the men scattered around the yard, at the house where the children were safe, at the life they'd built together from ashes and regret. "I decided that some choices don't have right answers. They just have consequences we learn to live with." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I decided that the man who saved my sister's children is the same man who just saved my life. And I decided that maybe, just maybe, some foundations are strong enough to build on, even when they're made of sorrow." But before Sterling could respond, young Joseph appeared in the doorway, his face pale as moonlight, speaking words that would change everything once more. Joseph stood in the doorway like a small prophet, his 6-year-old face grave with the weight of secrets too large for his narrow shoulders. Behind him, James pressed close, their twin bond manifest in the way they seemed to share the same breath, the same terrible knowledge. "Uncle Sterling," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the yard where the aftermath of violence still smoked in the morning air. "We need to tell you something. About the fire. About Mama and Papa." Sterling felt the world tilt on its axis. Beside him, Myrtle's face had gone white as fresh snow, her derringer forgotten in her trembling hand. "What is it, son?" Sterling's voice gentled automatically, the way it always did when addressing the children who'd become his heart. James stepped forward, completing his brother's thought in the way twins do. "We heard them talking that night, before the fire started. They weren't in their bedroom like everyone thought. You can almost hear the silence that followed, heavy as a held breath, pregnant with the weight of revelation." Joseph nodded solemnly. "They were in the cellar with us. Mama was sick with fever, and Papa was taking care of her. They sent us upstairs to get blankets. But then we smelled smoke." James continued, his small hand finding his brother's. "And we got scared, so we went back downstairs to find them." Sterling's mind reeled. If Mary and Thomas had been in the cellar, if they'd gone upstairs after the children came down. "Papa told us to stay in the cellar," Joseph said. "He said the smoke was bad upstairs, and we should wait for help. He said someone would come. And then you came," James finished. "But Mama and Papa, they went upstairs to try to save some of Mama's things. Her wedding dress, the picture of Grandmama. They said they'd be right back." The truth hit Sterling like a physical blow. Mary and Thomas hadn't been trapped upstairs when he arrived. They'd gone up after he'd found the children, while he was making his first rescue trip. By the time he'd returned for the second child, they were already cut off by the flames. "They knew," Joseph whispered. "They knew the house was falling down. But they went up anyway, because Mama said some things were worth the risk." Sterling sank to his knees in the dirt, the weight of months of guilt suddenly lifting from his shoulders only to be replaced by something even heavier. The knowledge that Mary and Thomas had made their own choice, knowing the cost. Myrtle moved toward the children with the slow, careful steps of someone walking through a dream. "Boys," she said softly, "why didn't you tell us this before?" The twins exchanged a look that held lifetimes of shared understanding. "Because everyone was so sad," James said simply. "And we thought maybe it was our fault for going upstairs in the first place. We thought if we told you that Mama and Papa went up to get things instead of staying with us, you'd think they loved old dresses more than us," Joseph added, his voice breaking on the last words. Sterling reached out and pulled both boys into his arms, feeling their small bodies shake with sobs they'd been holding back for months. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "Your Mama and Papa loved you more than life itself. They stayed with you as long as they could, and they only left because they thought they could get back to you. But they didn't get back," James whispered against Sterling's shoulder. "No," Sterling agreed. "They didn't. But not because they didn't love you. Because sometimes loving someone means taking risks, even when you know the cost might be everything." Myrtle knelt beside them, her own tears falling freely now. "Your Mama was like that," she said softly. "Even when we were little, she'd risk everything for the people she loved. She'd climb the highest trees to get a kitten down, wade into the deepest creek to save a drowning bird." She looked up at Sterling, and he saw forgiveness in her eyes, not just for him, but for herself, for the guilt they'd both been carrying, like stones in their hearts. "She made her choice," Myrtle continued, "the same way Uncle Sterling made his. The same way I made mine when I picked up that gun this morning. Sometimes love looks like running into danger, and sometimes it looks like running toward safety. But it's always about protecting what matters most." Sterling stood slowly, his arms still around the boys. "What mattered most to your parents was making sure you were safe. And what matters most to me is making sure you always know how much you're loved." The children from the house began to emerge, Sarah with her rag doll clutched tight, Everett with his hair standing on end and his eyes wide with the excitement of adventure survived. They clustered around the adults like flowers seeking sun, their young faces bright with the resilience that children possess in abundance. "Are the bad men gone?" Sarah asked, her voice small but brave. "Yes, little one," Sterling said. "They're gone." "And is Miss Myrtle staying?" This from Everett, who'd grown to love the woman who'd brought music and laughter back to their house. Sterling looked at Myrtle, seeing her, as if for the first time, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, not as a judge of his actions, but as a woman who'd chosen to love despite the cost, to build despite the ashes, to stay despite the fear. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether she thinks a foundation built on truth is stronger than one built on secrets." Myrtle smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "I think," she said, "that the strongest foundations are built on forgiveness and hope and the courage to love even when love is complicated." She looked at the letter that still lay forgotten by her carpetbag, then at the children gathered around them, then at Sterling's face. "I think Philadelphia will have to wait." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and promise, Sterling Knox stood surrounded by his family. The son he'd raised, the children he'd saved, the woman who'd saved him in return. The voices he'd been hearing in the wind weren't accusations after all. They were blessings, whispered by the dead to the living. Take care of each other. Love fiercely. Build something beautiful from the ashes. And in the distance, where the Hartwell place had once stood, wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Purple lupins and golden paintbrush, growing strong in soil enriched by sorrow and watered by tears. Reaching toward the light with the stubborn persistence of hope itself. That if you enjoyed this tale of love rising from ashes, be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, romance, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us together through the darkest nights. Speaking of bonds, we'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know which corner of the world you're calling home.